Welcome everybody, and I see a lot of members of our community, our larger community in the audience, and I'm glad to see you. And Andrew and your group, thank you very much for initiating this and also for demonstrating in front of everybody how elegant and eloquent our students are. I really don't think I can follow that act, so I'm not going to try. So, the younger Professor TEACHOUT, welcome to Vermont Law School. Welcome back, I should say. So ZEPHYR TEACHOUT, as you all know, is a professor at Fordham University School of Law in New York. She's thought about a lot and written about the issue of corruption in America, and I think in her recent book and in her other writings caused a lot of us to rethink how we use the word corruption. In her work, she argues, and I think her argument is persuasive personally, that our society, and in particular our courts, have so limited the definition of what corruption is, what is corruption, that a priori the problem has just gone away. And that we really don't have to address the larger issue of the purchase of political power through money, despite the fact that the historical definition of corruption was much broader and embraced that issue. And that the most recent manifestation of that trend is contained in the reasoning in Justice Kennedy's opinion in Citizens United. This is a place which believes in walking the walk, in actually doing what you believe in, and Professor TEACHOUT admirably, in my view, took her concerns in her recent run for the Democratic nomination for governor of New York, and I think fittingly was running against an opponent who was probably over 100 times better funded. I mean, how appropriate. And she garnered over 34% of the vote in a campaign which personally, I would say that was a successful campaign. So, Professor TEACHOUT, welcome, come up, tell us what you think.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me and for that beautiful introduction, both of you. When I was running for governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo sued me to try to get me off the ballot, claiming that I was a Vermonter. And that meant that he didn't like mentioning my name. We called it the Voldemort. Mentioned our name, I might get a higher percentage of the vote. But I actually was then, unfortunately, not able to mention Vermont as much as I would like to. Because I believe that so much of my own belief in the possibility of self-government and the possibility of having people really control their own lives, which is a remarkable and almost mad ambition, but I think one of the most beautiful ambitions, comes from living in a place and a community where people live that all the time. Where if you walk with a politician down the street, citizens will come up and demand things from them instead of treat them like celebrities. And I think that is what we are aiming for. In corruption circles, there's, as you might guess, corruption-specific humor. There's one joke that's often told, the places vary. It can be Saudi Arabia and China, or two different states in this country, but two good friends go off to seek their fortune. They haven't seen each other for about 20 years, and then one visits the other and finds out that he's actually the governor of this region or area or state. And says, how did you make, and also, sorry, he finds that he's the governor, and he looks around. This guy didn't have very much money when he was younger, and he has this incredible palace, wonderful cars, beautiful land, and he says, how did you make so much money? And the guy says, "You see that bridge?" Looks out the window. He says, "Yeah." He goes, I took a percentage. So the guy goes, "Okay, I got it. And he goes back to where he's from, and 10 years later, his friend comes and visits him and finds that he has twice the palace, twice the cars, twice the land, and says, where did you get your money? How did you do this? How did you do this?" And the guy says, "Look out the window. See that bridge?" And the guy says, "No." So in many ways, what I am concerned about is the second kind of corruption, not the first kind of corruption. As I was joking with my old wonderful cross-country coach, Jim Eakin, who I think is here tonight, well, I'm actually in favor of not necessarily more, but more bribery, less corruption. That what is most concerning and corrosive in our current society is a kind of self-serving behavior by those in power, and those in power because they are giving money or because they themselves are governing, that is threatening to undermine the very infrastructure of our society such that we may not have roads and bridges and schools and the kinds of things that enable the secure baseline of a thriving economy and a thriving democracy. So what I am concerned about is the kind of corruption that cannot be necessarily defined by criminal law. But when I talk about corruption, I mean when those in power, including US citizens, use that public power for private, narrow, selfish ends. The Supreme Court completely disagrees with this. And the reason I wrote this book, Corruption in America, is to lay out various reasons for my disagreement with the court. It really started as a letter to Justice Kennedy and Justice Scalia and Justice Roberts. Because the current Supreme Court believes that corruption is only when there is an explicit quid pro quo exchange, when there's some kind of open agreement where you will pass this law in exchange for giving this kind of donation. Now, this might sound like a dinner party debate, that if Justice Kennedy and I were at dinner, we could both sit there and drink our wine, and I'd say corruption is this, and he'd say corruption is that, and that's the end of it. But actually, the stakes are incredibly high, because the Supreme Court's definition of corruption is at the center of Citizens United and McCutcheon versus FEC, and a whole series of cases in which the court has struck down over and over again laws that are designed to make self-government more likely. And the reason it struck them down is because of a 1976 case, Buckley versus Vallejo, and ever since 1976, and I know some of you are studying that right now, is that right? In 1976, the court said, well, we have a problem with the fact that when you spend money in political arenas, that implicates your First Amendment rights. So we don't want to allow the government to cut off your First Amendment rights by cutting off your ability to spend money in a political arena. So we can allow certain limitations on spending money in the political arena, but only when it serves an anti-corruption interest. You can only have campaign finance laws if they're designed to stop corruption. And because of that case, we've now had a 40-year fight about what corruption means. Because the first question is answered by the fact that it's a campaign finance law that, say, limits contributions or limits expenditures. And then the second question is, does it serve corruption? If you have my view that corruption is when those in public power use it for narrow ends, then campaign finance laws and limits on corporate spending serve that anti-corruption goal. And if you have Justice Kennedy's view that corruption is just quid pro quo, campaign contribution laws don't do that much. You can just use criminal bribery laws for that. We should focus all our attention on criminal bribery laws. So this fight led me to investigate what we've thought historically about corruption. What has corruption meant in American history? And the first third of the book is really an argument about the Constitutional Convention itself. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, the framers talked about corruption all the time. It was kind of the lens through which they saw almost every problem. The problem of how big should a House of Representatives be? How big should the Senate be? What day should we elect a president, and should it be the same day for every state? How big should the veto be? Every one of those questions and dozens of others were run through the ringer of, will it be more or less likely to cause corruption or not? So the question for the veto, for instance, was, well, if the veto is too high, if the veto number is too high, then the executive might be able to buy off through influence and promises a small number of lawmakers and thereby really control the entire agenda. The question about whether the size of the houses led to sort of a fierce debate about who was more likely to be corrupt, elites or popular representatives. And some of the most interesting debates, what George Mason called the cornerstone of the convention, came out of a whole series of debates about a corruption concern they called the problem of placemen. So the problem of placemen is what they saw in England, where the king would, because the king had the power to appoint people to offices, like a post office job or other civil service job, representatives would get elected by their borough, but once they were elected, they would actually serve the king because the king would give them a place, would give them an office. Does that make sense? So their greater pay was coming from the king, even though they were supposed to be representing the boroughs. And in fact, they're not. And they argued about this over and over again, and then in the Constitution we have a provision that forbids holding an elected office and an appointed office at the same time. And Mason thought this was sort of the cornerstone of the convention. I actually think this has a lot of contemporary resonance now because we have placemen in a different way. People who go into elected office but serve their future job as a lobbyist. And what their concern was about the psychology. When you have two masters, who do you serve? Now, over 50% of people who go to Congress go on to become lobbyists, up from 7% just a few decades ago. So if you think about yourself, a lot of you are about to leave law school, you often are going to be serving your future masters, your future employers. And if your future employer is a lobbyist of a certain category, even when you're in office, you're going to be serving that other master. Another thing they talked about around the convention was the problem of gifts, the worry that even a simple gift could make you be more sympathetic to the gift giver, even if there wasn't an explicit exchange. So there's a provision in the Constitution that forbids accepting a gift of any kind whatever. It's this kind of petulant clause from foreign powers. And that came from concerns that Benjamin Franklin would be corrupted by receiving a snuff box from the King of France, and might then later take French commercial interests too much into account instead of his own obligations to his Americans. So we have this convention, this focus on corruption, and then after the convention, Hamilton, when asked about it, says that what did you do at the convention? We enacted every practicable obstacle against cabal and corruption. So they really saw their function as fighting this. One way to understand it is they really held England in very high regard. And as Patrick Henry said, look at the finest fabric human nature has ever reared, but it has been rent by corruption. So they saw this incredible model, but the deep flaw they saw was the ways in which structures had led to people being more self-serving. And if you think that all this talk about corruption was about explicit bribery, quid pro quo, it just wasn't. It was less than 1% of the times corruption was talked about. It was talked about in terms of bribery. And for the most part, there were no bribery laws applying to legislators. There are bribery laws applying to judges, but not to legislators. Well, that's a hopeful beginning, but of course, then there's the next 230 years puzzle of what corruption means in practice in law. It's one thing to have a convention where you try to build structures to protect against it, another to make that real in the life of the law. And there's these really interesting puzzles that come up over and over again. One is the puzzle of, is a law ever not a law because a majority of the people who passed it had a private interest in its outcome? So I'll give you an example. There's a scandal, the Yazoo land scandal. In the early decades of our country, everybody had an opinion on Yazoo. You were either pro or anti-Yazoo. And what had happened is the state of Georgia had given away acres and millions of acres of lands for pennies on the acre. It's been called the real estate deal of the millennium. And they sold it when all but one of the Georgia lawmakers had a direct private interest in stock or cash in the land sale. And since this is a time where there's no criminal bribery laws, the only response they had was to unelect those legislatures, which they did. Every single one of them was kicked out. And then the people of Georgia were so unhappy about this land deal, it wasn't just enough to kick them out. They actually had a bonfire and burnt the law. But there's this legal question that remained. Did that contract hold or not? Was that deal so fundamentally corrupt because the land companies had bribed the lawmakers one by one that the sale wasn't actually a sale? This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in a legendary Supreme Court argument, because I think it is the only one where one of the lawyers had to take a break to sober up. That was the lawyer for Georgia, and they did not win. Justice Marshall, who himself had been a land speculator, says, well, how do I know that this is corrupt, but another sale where 3 lawmakers are bribed isn't corrupt? How can I tell the difference between a corrupt law and a not corrupt law? And this actually persists as a question in a series of cases over the last couple hundred years. Another really interesting puzzle for corruption law is, what do you do with lobbying? Is lobbying, what is lobbying? I think a lot of scholars on the left, as well as on the right, avoid talking about the threat of lobbying because it's so difficult to even talk about infringing it at all without infringing any kind of First Amendment rights. It seems like the sort of heart and soul of what the First Amendment is, the ability to petition government. But this is not the way we've always thought about it. In fact, for about 100 years in our history, most courts thought of lobbying as corrupt. You wouldn't enforce a contract to lobby. So the corruption law of lobbying wasn't dealt with through criminal law, although lobbying was a felony in Georgia, a felony in California. It was dealt with through contract law. So if the dean and I have a contract where I'm going to put a roof on his house, and I put a roof on his house, and then ask him to pay me, and he doesn't pay me, I'll take him to court. We'll have a contract law case to enforce the contract. And likely I will be able to get paid because the court will say, yes, the contract needs to be enforced. But there's certain kinds of contracts we don't enforce. Certain kinds of things that you cannot sell. Sex, organs. In New York City, I always talk about Metro cards. That probably won't work as well here. So you can own something but not be able to sell it. It is not a vendable, in the language of the 20th century, not a sellable thing. And personal influence over lawmakers was considered by courts not a sellable thing because it would be too corrupting to be able to sell your ability to influence lawmakers. So you could do it yourself, but not sell that capacity. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these cases refusing to enforce contracts to lobby. There's an 1874 Supreme Court case where an old man is too ill to travel from Virginia to Washington, D.C. to ask for the thousands of dollars he's owed by the federal government. He is in fact owed that money, so he hires a Boston lawyer. The Boston lawyer goes to Washington, he writes letters, he has meetings, he persuades the government, he gets his money back, and then asks for payment. And the old man says, I'm not going to pay you, that was a corrupt contract to lobby. So this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Should you enforce this contract or not? And the court concludes that they cannot enforce this contract, even though there's no evidence in this case of the lobbyist bribing a lawmaker. Because you could understand that might be one concern, is the lobbyist would get paid to pass a bill, then the lobbyist would just pay the lawmaker. No evidence of that in this case, but the court said, if we allow this contract, then the great corporations of our day will hire adventurers to make their case in the state houses, and every right-thinking man would call that corrupt. So that was the law of the land really until the 1920s. There's a series of reasons that changed. including the rise of the First Amendment, but also including changes in contract law. And then there's another puzzle, which is an ongoing puzzle in corruption law, which is what is corruptly to a jury? And for a long time, really once we started enforcing criminal bribery laws until the 1970s, if there was the language of corruptly in a statute, a jury would basically decide what that meant. So the jury had the power. Just to get a broad outline, most of what you think of as bribery laws are basically, the basic elements are giving a thing of value with intent to influence some kind of governmental action. Those are the basic elements of most of these bribery laws. But it often includes the language of corruptly. Giving a thing of value corruptly with intent to influence action. So for many, many years, juries would then be sitting in their rooms of 12 deciding what corruptly meant. Of course, we don't know what those conversations were, but it was decided on this sort of highly decentralized way. However, we do know that the courts that talked about these cases often talked about them in the same kind of terms that we heard in the lobbying cases, in the same kind of terms that we heard at the Constitutional Convention, which is that the corruption we're worried about is when people in power are out for themselves as opposed to focused on the broader public. So I want to read to you a passage that I forgot to read before, but it sort of relates to this. Up until 1976, there's a real understanding, and I was really glad Andrew brought up this question of the person. There was a real understanding of the person as being capable of being either egotistical or public-oriented. And that we have both of those capacities within ourselves. And that it is the job of designing a constitution or designing laws to design laws that make it more likely that the public-oriented part of ourselves comes out and less likely that the selfish part of ourselves comes out. So it's a real vision of the person, and you can find this vision of the person in Benjamin Franklin, who I use as kind of a motif throughout the book. And I love Franklin because he was known as the most corrupt of all corrupt men. And the corrupt old fox. And he was the oldest person at the Constitutional Convention. So he was not naive. He knew of what he spoke. He had an experience of himself dealing with the pressures of what's it like to lose an appointment because you disagree with those in power. To deal with the pressures and to see the effects of gifts. And at the Constitutional Convention, he was the strongest advocate for a kind of psychological understanding of the person as being easily corruptible, but also capable of great public orientation. So in the early spring of 1787, Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old, wrote an old friend from France about pigeons, lightning, mutual friends, and the art of ballooning. Showing off both his enthusiasm and his sense of a declining body, he wrote about his dream of having a French balloon that was large enough to lift him, being led by a string, held by a man walking on the ground. Franklin, as ever, believed in the possibilities of progress, but wanted to be sure that his flights into electricity, politics, and air travel were grounded. A little more than 6 weeks after writing this letter at the opening of the Constitutional Convention, he was carried into the Constitutional Convention, not lifted by a hot air balloon, but on a sedan chair because he was too weak to walk. But he was not only aware of his own body's degeneration, he saw how the body politic could degenerate if given the chance. His first speech he wrote out because he was so determined to get the ideas out there. And it was about psychology. It was about the passions of the human heart. It was about the problems of putting the love of money and the love of power in the same position. And he urged that we maintain that kind of focus of how to build structures to not allow that. And Franklin was in some ways, like a lot of the founders, extraordinarily optimistic and extraordinarily pessimistic at the same time. I actually think that's one of the best combinations for any kind of political activism. And he thought the country would last a couple of hundred years. So I didn't think you'd be so precise with 1976 and Buckley versus Vallejo. So in 1976, and then really since then, that case that I mentioned earlier, Buckley versus Vallejo, came down, where the court starts talking about corruption in a different way. It starts talking about corruption more and more, although not quite so much in the Buckley case, but in cases afterwards, more and more in terms of just these kinds of transactional exchanges, not in terms of this kind of nature of the human who can move from the public orientation to the private orientation. So in many ways, I think that this fight that we've been having for the last 30 years in the courts about what is corruption is really also a public fight about what a person is, about whether a person is capable of public orientation. And for those of you who study law and economics or the influence of the Chicago School, there's a very clear idea of, or a very, I believe, limited idea about what a person is that comes out of that philosophy. The idea of the person as, with some complications, fundamentally self-oriented and profit maximizing. And that idea has then invaded our legal academy in a lot of ways, and certainly invaded the court in its own definitions of corruption. In some ways, I see this as sort of an echo of an old fight between Hobbes and Montesquieu. Montesquieu was seen as the most important influencer of the convention, and he had a broad view of the importance of the spirit of virtue, and Hobbes had sort of a dismal view of that. As one scholar said, it's not so much that Hobbes and Montesquieu disagreed about corruption, it's just that the idea of corruption didn't make any sense to Hobbes. Whereas for Montesquieu, it was the central concern. Montesquieu was most concerned about people becoming narrow. Hobbes thought people were already, in some ways, narrow. So we're having this philosophical fight inside this word in the courts. And as I said, I think the stake is really high. The stakes are really high. I do want to take a more technical, besides the definition of a person, a more technical response to what the court is doing, though, with its definition of corruption, because I think not only is it problematic in terms of its understanding of democracy and history, it's internally problematic. The court wants to define corruption by, the modern court, by reference to criminal bribery laws, okay? In fact, in McCutcheon versus FEC, Roberts cited a case about a criminal federal bribery law. But there's a real problem here. Think about it. Do you guys know about the idea of positivism in general? The idea that sort of norms are defined, or good are defined by what is written in law, or embodied in law itself. Corruption and positivism make a terrible, terrible fit. If you're going to define corruption based on what is already embodied in criminal law, that means that there was no corruption in Georgia in the early 19th century because there were no criminal bribery laws, right? That means that depending on what state you live in, something might be corrupt or not corrupt. And perhaps most importantly, it means that this word corruption, I think the reason I'm so drawn to it is it is a word that those out of power use to accuse those in power. Is that this word corruption is then defined by those with the most power. So that if the Supreme Court wants to define corruption by reference to federally passed criminal bribery laws, it's already cutting the knees out of the most powerful part of the language and history of corruption itself. And then is internally inconsistent, because what's corrupt one year is not going to be corrupt another year. And moreover, when you're reviewing a campaign finance law, how do you know it's not an anti-bribery law? Like, which kind of laws do you refer to as your positive source for defining corruption law itself? There's another, that's what's happened on the right, but I will say also there's been a running away from corruption from the more liberal scholars in this area since Buckley versus Vallejo, since 1976. Instead, most of the people who share my own views about campaign finance reform or the mistakes in Buckley or Citizens United or McCutcheon versus FEC, most of them will tell you that corruption is not really a problem. It's a derivative problem from equality. All we really care about is equality. And I also care about equality, don't get me wrong. But basically, that when we're talking about problems with campaign finance or who has power, the problem is everybody doesn't have the same amount of power. And I think they're right, that is, if not, one of the most central problems in our current political system. But I also think that we do ourselves a great disservice if we run away from the wisdom of the psychological framing of the founding era and actually the first 200 years. And if we run away from the hope that people in public office will be genuinely motivated, at least sometimes, by public good, as opposed to just transactionally considering all equally. In some ways, I think that we actually have to remoralize a part of our public life and understand that we have to engage the spirit and not just the transactional elements of it. So when I use history in this way, I want to be very clear that I am not I'm not a traditional originalist. I'm drawn to it in a lot of ways. As I said, this started as a letter, and I have this wonderful picture of Larry Lessig giving this book to Justice Scalia. I inscribed it for our shared love of the wisdom of the founding era. But I am not necessarily driven, just by talking to the justices. I also want to talk to us about our own identity. And I have a view that I sometimes call kind of Langston Hughes patriotism. I think there's extraordinary wisdom and value to be found in our past that we can have without glamorizing or valorizing the Constitutional Convention as the wisest and best people that ever lived. Our framers were wrong about race in terrible and cruel ways. And they were wrong about gender. And a lot of them, I think, got class entirely wrong. Some of them got it right. But that doesn't mean, I think, that we should throw out all of our history. So part of what this book is a view of what history, how to use history. And when I say I'm a Langston Hughes patriot, it comes from this poem from Langston Hughes' own vision of America, which you might know. It's a vision which says, we have extraordinary wisdom in our past, which we should use, and we should hold on to the best parts of our dreams. But that doesn't mean we have to sentimentalize some kind of lost golden age and try to be returning. Instead, we should be looking forward to that hot air balloon that's grounded by the hot air balloon that Franklin dreamed of. So he says, let America be America again. Let it be the dream the dreamers dreamed. America was never America to me. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot and graft and stealth, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, and make America, America again.
Amen.
So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to make America, America again? I'm happy to talk about this a little more. I am personally committed to ending the toxic system of private financing of elections. I think you guys all felt that too, and you can respond. I just got back on the stump for a second. And often we talk about it just in these positive terms, which is good. We need public financing, but more, it is unacceptable. Maybe public financing isn't perfect, but private financing of elections necessarily daily corrupts our politics in such a powerful way, because it means that the job of our leaders is to be salesmen to the 0.1% every day that they are in public office. And they necessarily, again, if we're going to bring a psychological orientation, it takes what is best in us, which is our ability to listen to people and actually learn from them. That's great. But if you're listening and actually learning and using all your powerful human empathy towards the 0.1%, you are not serving this country. So we've got a broken engine, and we have to end that. And the other reform that I think is essential is I think we have to break up the big companies. That there's far too much concentrated power, and that's true in area after area, whether it's energy or banking or big data. You see this extraordinary concentration of power, and that concentration of power then makes it hard for people to speak as citizens because they are either within one of these large feudal companies, or those companies are the ones that are by far the most likely to be actually abusing our current private financing system and abusing the super PAC system. Now, what's exciting about these two solutions is that I don't actually need to talk to the Supreme Court anymore about these, because these are both possible within our current existing framework. The Supreme Court allows us to pass antitrust laws, and the Supreme Court allows us to pass private financing laws. So I'd also love the court to be reconstituted, but in the meantime, I do actually think that there's a kind of pessimism and optimism that we can bring to the moment to actually reshape power in this country. Because at core, this is about both human psychology and about power. So I end the book saying that my hope is that lawmakers will quickly act. Actually, I should say it. In the period where we're gradually losing the conception of corruption from the 70s until now, I have a whole series of arguments about why that happens. And one of the arguments is that the Supreme Court has just gotten too abstract. 1976, when Buckley versus Vallejo was decided, and 2007, when the court started going off on this strange tangent on corruption, were the two years, and ever since 2007, where we didn't have a single person with political experience on the Supreme Court. In between, we had Sandra Day O'Connor. But the absence of politicians who understand influence and understand that when you're on the phone with somebody, you don't need to make a quid pro quo in order to have influence, I think has had a real effect. That is not why I ran for office. So, I do feel like there's a kind of abstraction and almost naivete on the part of the court. You know, sometimes people ascribe them bad motives, but they're not necessarily out for themselves. I think they don't actually understand how politics works in a very real way. So my hope is that lawmakers will quickly act to pass public funding systems and anti-monopoly laws to protect our civic culture. I sometimes feel like our country is both young and old, like the 81-year-old Franklin, floating in his hoped-for air balloon. We are in many ways inside his magical experiment, and it has been every bit as extraordinary as imagined. It has brought people to levels often dreamed of and rarely achieved, where they live together in peace, exercising collective power over their own lives. I have no doubt this represents one of the greatest achievements in human history. But democracy without constant vigilance against corruption is an unstable, unmoored thing, subject to great gusts of whimsy and likely to collapse. There's no one walking below holding the string. We need obstacles, restraints, an unbreakable connection between the public and its representatives. Thank you.
That was wonderful. So now I think we're going to open it up for a little bit of Q&A.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have a microphone floating around somewhere. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand. And,
And when you ask your question, we would ask that you please speak into one of the mics, not because we don't trust your ability to project your voice, but simply because it benefits our recording. Thank you.
Hello. So my name is Life, and I am the state director for Wolfpack, New Mexico. And we had a resolution that was going to call for a convention of the states. Didn't make it through this time, went through committee, but we have another one coming through. Vermont and 4 other states have done that. So that's something that we're doing. So, but I'm wondering for you, that has some problems, constitutional, runaway convention being one of the ones. So could you comment on the runaway convention conspiracy and why that's a big block for the states, and then maybe also what the other options are federally to get it done, and what the obstacles there would be.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What he's talking about is a plan to just state by state hold conventions leading to a constitutional amendment eventually. And I support this plan. But I do want to comment on it briefly. So I support this. I support the people who are doing Move to Amend. A handful of you might have heard me on the radio the other day saying this, so excuse me for repeating myself, but I actually think this is really important. It is one thing to support constitutional amendments, which I think people should be doing. It is entirely another to allow politicians to only support constitutional amendments and not do anything about private financing of elections. Does that make sense? Because most politicians actually know right now that Citizens United polls terribly. And you probably know people who are building lists, big email lists, off of saying they want a constitutional amendment. Okay? But if they're not also pushing for public financing of elections, they're not doing what they could do now. So in many ways, it can be, not what Wolfpack is doing, but what some politicians are doing, can be kind of a cheap show of support, because you're symbolically saying, I want a constitutional amendment, but you're not doing what you could do now. So in terms of accountability, I think we should always be very clear that it's great and it's insufficient, and that a real show of support for those in power is to do both. I am less concerned about a runaway convention than other people. The concern is that, and it's a very real concern, is that those who already have money, if we had a constitutional convention, would dominate that convention and would so successfully dominate the messaging in that convention that we'd end up with a worse system than we would now. Is that what you...
Yeah, go on.
Okay, well, there's different concerns about it. First, I actually don't think a constitutional... I like the strategy. The strategy in the past has led to congressional action, which I think is actually a better way to think about what it's doing, is it puts pressure on. It's sort of it's a lever for congressional action as much as it is leading to a convention itself. And second, I'm a populist in a very deep way, and I think we're in. Generally have a trust for more local decentralized action than other people, even recognizing the risks involved. But that's part of the reason my focus is more on public financing, as much as I love what Wolfpack is doing, because we can do it now. And then once you have that system in place, and once all the baby politicians are trained in public financing instead of being trained in private financing, which is how they're trained now, then you actually have a different network of power. And you have different possibilities that come out of that.
Hi, ZEPHYR. I'm not an attorney or law student. I'm a poet and writer, so I don't know if I have more of a combination of pessimism and optimism than the other people in the room. But I have two questions. One is, something struck me very profoundly that you said. Right now we have antitrust laws. Right now. So my first question is, how far do you think the pendulum will swing? And I'm not asking so much from, I'm not trying to judge your vision or your philosophical, how much pessimism you have about this, but more from a structural, what's in place, where will it take us, how long will we have antitrust laws, given that they're overturning and doing so much that is in this, down this road. And then the second question, and you maybe ask this all the time, I haven't seen you since you were on Bill Moyer's, but will you run for office again? Thank you.
So as a poet, you will appreciate my first response, which is to neither of your questions. that came out wrong. I think a pendulum is not a helpful metaphor. We have a broken, whether it's a broken machine, a pendulum leads to passivity. It's the sense that this thing is swinging, and where are we on this swinging thing? As opposed to, as Walt Whitman says, democracy rests finally upon us. There is no final reliance but on us. So now I'll answer your questions. We basically got rid of most antitrust laws in 1981 with Ronald Reagan. And if I could, wave a wand, I'd pass public financing of elections and just go back to the 1965 antitrust regime instead of the 1981 one. That's possible. That's something Obama could do. That's something that if we build a movement, it can happen. And the best evidence that it can happen is that the FCC chairman, a former lobbyist for the cable companies, just announced that we're going to have net neutrality, which is an antitrust principle, in this country, despite incredible Comcast and other corporate resistance. So I believe there is an enormous latent energy in this country for taking on non-neutral owners of grids, whether that be the internet or the electricity grid, and then taking on and busting up big countries. I think it's there, and it's just a matter of building a political movement. But the capacity is there in the law. This isn't the Supreme Court. This is in us. And your second question, yeah, I'll run for office again. Especially if there's public financing.
So my name's Karen, and I'm right here. I have a public campaign financing question for you, and it's Vermont specific, so I hope I don't get you in too much trouble for talking too much about Vermont. But I'm relatively new to Vermont, so I was pretty pleased to be in a state where there is an existing state-level public campaign financing law. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on something that I learned about last week. So I'm referring to the Vermont Attorney General suing Dean Corrin, the candidate for lieutenant governor from last year, for a violation of the public campaign finance law having to do with an email, which according to some is valued at about $255. And the penalty would be, I think, closer to $72,000. I was wondering if you wanted to speak. Well, and then as a result of that, my understanding is that Dean Corrin, in response, is asserting that the public campaign finance law is unconstitutional. So if you want to correct me on any of my facts there, and I would love to hear any of your other thoughts too.
As a lawyer, politician, and person of some integrity, I'm not going to speak on these particular facts. But I will answer your question. I will answer some things that I think are interesting in the Corrin case. Well, I have not read any, I do not know the details, so I'm really not speaking about the case. But what I understand is that it's a case about coordination between the Democratic Party and a candidate. And coordination is when basically there's limits after Citizens United, but even before, there are parties that can independently spend money, okay? You're independently, on your own, you're gonna spend $10,000 on my behalf. There's also limits on how much you can give me. You can give me $500. So $500 fine, $10,000 fine. But if you and I talk enough so that I tell you, on Tuesday I'm coming out with my education platform, and I think it would be a good idea for you to wait until Wednesday morning until you come out with your ad. Essentially, you are working for me, and it's no longer this independent $10,000 spending, okay? So if we are going to have any sense in the post-Citizens United regime, you need very strict coordination laws. Otherwise, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Koch brothers super PAC, you can have a lot of conversations between candidates and people spending a lot of money outside. I think the FEC on the federal level has failed to pass good coordination rules, in part because it's structured in a way that it can't act. It's half Republicans, half Democrats. It's a deeply compromised institution. Without knowing anything about the case, I think we should look at what Vermont is doing with coordination laws, and it's extremely exciting and important if Vermont wants to have a pretty strict line on coordination laws, not because of the particular case, but because it means that when you are dealing with the Koch brothers or other sources of extraordinary power, you can't say, well, this was just a small amount of money. Does that make sense?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Bobby Sand. I have a question about which comes first, the chicken or the corrupt agricultural inspector. And present company excluded, of course. Do you think that ethically challenged people are naturally drawn to politics, or people who are otherwise well-meaning are corrupted by the system?
I think otherwise well-meaning people are corrupted by the system, and then some people are drawn to it. I mean, I think this is part of actually why I also care about what's happening in the fight about public education, which I also think is a fight about what a person is. I think we're really complex, curious, strange people driven by a whole set of different things. And I don't know that I believe in the person pre-existing what they become later. It's sort of the fixed person, the model of just being revealed over time. I think actually structures do change who we are in some ways. So I think I'm more on the second line. And one thing I did not expect that came out of the campaign for me, and I think actually happens to a lot of politicians, is that I knew how corrupting it would be, but I didn't know how much affection it would pull out of me. How, like when I'd be riding the subway, I would just really care about the people more. Because you have then taken on the responsibility to say you want to advocate for them. And so I think you get both of these pressures. I think you see an extraordinary amount of public love that comes out of politicians, along with this kind of corrupting influence. And I think, I guess, again, more pushing to the second kind is that people get corrupted by the process, is that when your job is in Congress, 30 to 70% of your time is fundraising. Think about what that does to you as a person. Like, to make sense of yourself, you have to actually believe that you are talking to some of the better people in the world. Otherwise, you have to make sense of yourself as somebody who's just sort of half lying all the time. It's a terrible thing that we ask of people. And so I think it's more the latter. But I also think, look, I don't have a golden age. I want to be really insistent on that. I don't think, we can have a perfect, public, civic-minded, a lawmaking body where every commissioner is, wakes up every morning and only thinks about the public. Does that help?
May I ask a tiny, quick follow-up?
Yes.
Totally unfair.
Yes.
How do you, as governor of the Empire State, avoid that then?
Yeah, no, it's not unfair. I think it's completely fair. I like to think. I don't think I can avoid it. First of all, I don't think you can. I don't think I am not human. I think it helps to have studied it for a long time, so you come in with a greater inoculation of sort of understanding as an observer what you see happening to other people and being more wary. But I think, I guess what I think is there's a difference between being very clear about what your own principles are and being willing to compromise, and then not seeing the way in which you're compromising yourself and your core beliefs. Does that make sense? So I personally decided there's certain things I'd be willing to compromise on, but I'd still know what I wanted. But I really think we have to change the system.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and I'm a 1L here. Thank you, ZEPHYR, that was awesome. I guess when I hear talks like this, my question to myself is always like, hearing the great idea, but then asking about implementation and how you actually make this happen. So I'm just wondering, and you said something, I don't know the exact words, but about reviving the moral spirit of the community. And I'm just curious, how do you actually do that? They're great ideas, but on a very real day-to-day person that's busy working, has to feed their family, how do we really build that energy and create that change in a real way, past just having the idea?
Yeah, well, I don't have any answers. I mean, I have some ideas. One is just in our own language. So I think, now I'll be openly partisan, but speaking of my party, Democratic Party, I think that Democrats sometimes get really transactional in their language, assuming that people are only interested in pocketbook issues. And I think if we only speak to people in transactional ways, then that actually helps build our community in transactional ways. And the cost of that long term is quite large. I also think, as a year 1L, I also think a lot more people, including a lot more young people, need to run for office. And it's really hard to get people to run for office in their 30s and 40s. They're having families. I mean, I really respect that, but people are in different situations. And one of the great coups of those with power right now in the United States is to make the most active, politically engaged young people feel like politics is too corrupt to get involved in. Does that make sense? I was talking to a student at Syracuse, And she was all mad at her university, rightly so, and really well educated, really great leader. And after talking to her for a while, I said, you should run for office. And she said, I'm not going to run for office. What do you want to do later? Oh, I want to go work for a nonprofit. I want to protest. I want to learn. I want to push policy. Why do you want to run for office? But this is a very normal conversation. There's this big gap. And I pushed her. I was like, is it because it's corrupt? Is it because it's square? Showing my age, because I don't think, she knew what I was talking about. And she said half corrupt, half square. But if she isn't involved in politics, it's like we are talking about fighting power. And this is not, power doesn't give up without a fight. So we're going to fight power with millions of politically engaged young people who then decide to throw away the most important tool they have, which is to run for office because it's a little corrupt and square. Like, that is the kind of victory that makes Comcast and JP Morgan very happy. So I really, really think that, and I also think about it in terms of Hong Kong, like if those Hong Kong students had the capacity to run for office, they might have left the encampment earlier. That's what they were asking for. And we're not using that leverage and power in the way that we could. So it's not that other work isn't important, but electoral work, I obviously believe is really important.
Can I ask you about your campaign? The campaign that you just recently come out of. In what sense did you win? In what sense, perhaps, did you lose?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to say how I lost. I like to think that I had a small hand in banning fracking in New York, but most of the work had been done by the organizers before. I like to think that I have a small hand in making people a little less fearful in New York politics.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm also A1L. Thank you for coming.
Okay, so you ready to run?
I think that on running for young people, I think the main issue is money itself in politics. We obviously don't have the time on this earth to have had the connections and have made the friends that will finance a campaign that we, therefore, people will listen to us. Also, we're young, and so no one will listen. But I was wondering about, I know you take issue with strict collaboration laws, but in this day and age where things are more immediate, so you could say something now and then 10 minutes later there could be a post on Twitter or Facebook and you will catch flack for that. Well, how could you, is strict collaboration laws really effective? Would they really serve in this day of immediacy any real benefit? And would you comment also on my opinion that I think national party, the way that people can donate money to a national campaign and how it can influence a local election. For instance, I'm from Florida, and I was very strong. I supported the legalization of marijuana in Florida. It was a referendum and it lost by 2%. The main group that led the campaign against legalization was the Sheriff's Department in Florida, and one of its main contributors was Sheldon Adelson, who's a Nevada resident and runs the Sands Corporation, the casino corporation in Nevada. Why should someone in Nevada have any say in what is done in Florida? Thank you.
Those are both really fantastic questions, and I'm only going to be able to touch the surface of them. So I'll take the second one first. One of the things I like about public financing systems is that you get a matching fund. Say in New York City, if you raise $25, you'll get 6 times that from New York City, but only from other New York residents. So that besides encouraging people to spend time with those who can give $25 instead of $2,000, it also focuses your attention and your mind on New Yorkers as opposed to elsewhere. Because I think philosophically, as a matter of representation, except for the national offices, they should be locally representative. So I agree with that point, and I think there's many ways that you can build structures to support that. Your first point, I was a director of online organizing for Howard Dean's campaign, and I was not a lawyer on that campaign, but I had endless conversations with the lawyer at the time. It was my introduction to election law, about these coordination questions. When is it coordination? If we just put something up on our website, every one of the Dean support groups will know, and they can just mimic. All you need to do is put up your messaging, and then the Koch brothers can just mimic, right? So I think that's right. I don't think Citizens United was rightly decided, and I think our campaign finance laws should be different in general ways. However, I actually think that good coordination laws are really still very important. And again, I'm really not commenting on the Corin case because I really don't know the facts. But the coordination laws will, for example, limit your ability to share staff, limit your ability to move from a campaign to 2 days later taking a job at a super PAC that is then working for that is then supporting the candidate outside, because you've already coordinated at a very deep level the sort of molecular structure of the campaign, even if you're not coordinating that day. I think that matters. I think, and then if what we're concerned about is the Koch brothers taking the lead and the candidates following, which I think is the deepest concern, not the candidate taking the lead and the Koch brothers following. Does that make sense? Yeah. Then there's still a real power in having rules about non-communication, where the Koch brothers are still waiting to see what the issues that the candidate is going to run on. Having said that, I definitely take your point. The way Madison would have thought about it, I don't know, or the way I think Madison might have thought about it, is that our job, again, as Hamilton said, is to build every practicable obstacle to corruption. That doesn't mean you stop it, but you make it more difficult. You create friction. And so one of the things that Madison repeatedly talked about is, this business of corruption will be hard to achieve if you have to go through this mechanism and this mechanism and this mechanism. And so that's what we're trying to do, is create friction, make it harder, or in game theory terms, sort of make the collective action problem harder to solve. And so this is just friction. It's not perfect, but it's an important block that will make somebody with a lot of money less likely to have a conversation because they know they can't have a direct interaction with the candidate.
If I can go, if that's all right with everyone.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
ZEPHYR, tonight in the United Kingdom, there is a debate, actually it's probably on now, between 7 major political parties. In the United States, nationally, in Vermont, we have 3 major political parties, 4-ish. But nationally, we only have 2. Do you think that we need more parties taking part in these debates and adding more voice to national issues?
Yeah, am I going to get in trouble for not speaking in front of a mic? My own view is that ideally you would have internal pressure within the parties that allowed the parties to move a lot more themselves, as opposed to, so there's different issues. One is money in politics, and the other is sort of ideological change that isn't related to money in politics, and how do you cluster and represent around that. I don't think, maybe I should say this for all things, I don't think there are ideal systems. I think that every culture actually has different problems and different threats of corruption and different systemic responses. And I think we can sometimes be too quick. We should learn from other places, but not try to automatically import them, because there are different effects in different places. So I'm a little bit of American scholar, which doesn't mean I haven't looked at multi-party systems elsewhere. But the American tradition that I like within this vein is the system of fusion. And in a system of fusion, a candidate can run for more than one office. That also is fun. But a candidate can run for more than one party, but then their combined votes might allow them to win. So had I run in New York on the Democratic Party and the Populist Party and won 51% of the votes, with the majority of those coming from the Populist Party, then candidates everywhere would say, oh, it turns out we have to move more towards the populist party angle, but I wouldn't have in that process given up my base in the Democratic Party. So when you saw a lot more movement and a lot more parties in this country, we had fusion in basically every state. And I think that a strong fusion system helps to do that, and I've been an advocate here and elsewhere for better fusion laws.
Hello, Zephyr. My name's Nancy. I'm a 1L.
Hi.
And I'm sure you've heard about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the new trade agreement that they're trying to fast track.
You guys are all treating me like I'm a candidate. Like,
it's very worrying to me because essentially it's giving corporations global power to usurp any government and their regulations essentially to protect, their citizens. And so how do you think, as Americans, we can best combat the corrupting influence of multinational corporations and the corporate Bill of Rights that they're trying to get passed?
So you guys have amazing students here because you're asking unbelievably complex, great questions. Two things. I think it is possible, if not likely, the TPP will fail, which I think is not only a good thing, but another sign, along with net neutrality, that there is a real populist energy in this country that actually has political power, and that's very, very exciting. So starting with stopping the TPP is valuable. But I think a combination of trade and antitrust and sort of rethinking both redefining trade, because as you know with the TPP, many things are called trade and used under the framework of trade that might not traditionally be thought of as trade, but are real shifts of power and relocations of power. And then the second is, I think, really talking about what we think. I think of sometimes the original sin is how we separate our discussion of economics and our discussion of politics. And I think one of the real concerns with sort of unfettered globalization is how it undermines self-government itself. And I think you can feel that around the country and around the world. And hopefully getting more politicians who speak up about that, but also students who are doing the incredible work of organizing around it. I don't know if I'm calling or voices just keep coming at me.
I wanted to speak to the fact of young people talking about running for office with no money. You don't have to begin with governor. In the town of Hartford, we
But yes.
I'm talking, in the town of Hartford, we elected a select board member. She's 20 years old. She has her thesis to finish at UVM. She ran against two good old boys, one of whom you can forget, but she beat the other one by 12 votes. The select board has been incredibly welcoming to her. I think we're going to see her running for higher office in not too long, but it costs practically nothing to do something like that. And you can start with local commissions, school boards, select boards, and then get known and advance your way up so you can start with very little money.
I absolutely agree with that. I'm glad you said that because this brilliant young man back here, I wanted to rebut it, but I had two other points I had to make. Whether it's soil and water commissioner, there's extraordinary, interesting jobs too to be had. And there's often an investigatory angle to almost any public office where you can actually use it to learn things. So it's really interesting, even if you can't use it to act, you can use it to do local investigations. So yes, I agree.
Back here, Zephyr.
Hi again, my name is Juan. And what do you think about the judicial elections? In an investigation, Mother Jones magazine, they say since 2000, $250 million has been spent on judicial elections. What do you think about that?
I have not written about judicial elections, so I'll tell you my strong instinct, but it's not something I've deeply studied. I think it's the wrong way to go about appointing judges, or electing them, I guess. I think it's so inherently dangerous to have judges, which, unlike representatives who are inherently in some ways partisan and advocates, judges are not supposed to ever be advocates, but truly neutral, to have them go through a system which is so deeply compromising. So I'm opposed.
Professor Teachout, I'm not a 1L. But I am a native New Yorker, and my parents, who are in their 80s, are lifetime New Yorkers, and I'm here for them because they love you. My mom was so excited that I told her I was coming out here today. I am old enough and square enough to remember when the corporations that took all of this money that politicians raised had some public responsibilities. I was in college in the 1970s, and I get a big "I told you so" because I was busy fighting the deregulation of the broadcast industry. And so my question for you is part of the answer to all of this doing things that tend to make political money less valuable by just democratizing the avenues of communication that we have?
So yes, but it's really difficult. If I can sort of restate your question in a way that I think I understand it, is that the reason people raise money is so they can communicate. They also raise money to organize, but they use it for ads or online, increasingly online targeted ads. And so if you didn't need to raise money for that, then you actually would spend all your time listening and learning and trying to be persuasive, as opposed to raising money for the big ad buy, right? Is that, okay.
Perfect.
So yes, that would be great. And I have tried to think about how we do that in an internet era, because perversely, in some ways it is harder in an internet era to do it than in an era where you have a limited number of broadcast shows that almost everybody watches. Because if you have a limited number of broadcast shows that everybody watches, you can then sort of allow everybody some of that airtime and hope that it reaches enough people that you reach the level of being competitive in an election. Online, it's harder because what should we do? These are the questions I've asked myself. I don't have answers to them. Should you say that any website that has more than 1 million views a month has to carry local politicians' messages? What kind of obligations do we place to allow people to be meaningfully heard? Because I think the baseline question should always be, how do we make it possible for somebody to run for office and be meaningfully heard, not win, but be meaningfully heard, without becoming beggars at the feet of the wealthiest people in the world? That's the question. But I don't know mechanically how to do it in an internet era. That's the.
But you don't think that's a waste of time?
To think about it.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Professor Teachout. I am Nesabeth Rooks, and I'm an accelerated JD student. And I was just wondering if you think that, in terms of all the power being concentrated in the wealthy, if the felony disenfranchisement laws in America contribute to that concentrated power among the wealthy.
Yes. As a candidate, again, this is it's a wonderful forum, but it's a funny forum. It's between law and, but as a candidate, that's you, that's from my law school, that's great. I had a universal franchisement platform, which I sort of thought was one of the most radical parts of my platform. Nobody ever picked it up. I was very proud of our policy platforms because they all had links out on the website so you could do your independent research. But I believe in universal enfranchisement. And I think in Vermont and Maine are the only 2 states that have it. But I worked in North Carolina for 7 years. That was also on some of the flyers when Andrew Cuomo was trying to get me kicked off. Said they go back to North Carolina or go back to Vermont. It was a little confusing. But I worked there and I did a lot of voter registration there. And I was really affected by so many ex-felons who I met who didn't even know that they had the ability to re-register to vote. And thinking about the effect that had, not on them, but on their entire families. Thinking about the effect it has on a potluck. If 2 days before the election, you know one person at that potluck can't vote because, or doesn't believe they can vote because they're a felon. Just to be polite, you're not going to talk about the election. So it doesn't become part of your social community. So the effect of having high levels of interactions with the criminal justice system and disenfranchisement means that we're actually taking politics out of enormous swaths of American society, including the sort of broader scope of people who are around. So I really believe it's essential.
Yes, ZEPHYR. ZEPHYR.
Hey, Jim.
Past or present, maybe you don't want to answer this, but what do you think is the most egregious corruption case you saw in New York State? And if you don't want to talk about New York, nationwide?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have a top of mind answer. Because when I think of egregious corruption, what I'm really thinking about is what we're already seeing that is legal, perfectly legal.
I was surprised though, having lived down here a long time ago, but what was it, the speaker, Sheldon?
Yeah.
Yes.
So
He finally was, I mean, I lived down here 30 years ago and I think he was still around then.
Yeah.
But finally he gets caught.
Yeah, so the Speaker of the Assembly in New York is a millionaire many times over for no apparent reason. And he's a lawyer, which actually makes it really complicated. So this happens now, but it was happening in the 19th century, and you see it in the old 19th century books, is you just put a lawyer on your payroll who's also a politician, and then attorney-client privilege protects the communications with your client. So you don't actually know why the client is paying. Is it for legal services? But for a lot of what Sheldon Silver did, there's no real evidence that he actually performed the legal services that he was getting paid for. Having said that, I'm really glad he has stepped down as Speaker, but the circumstantial evidence looks terrible in terms of him working for big real estate interests and against the interests of his own constituents in the Lower East Side, let alone his own constituents in the state. But I want to wait and see the evidence. Albany does, I mean, this is where culture does fit in, is that I think Albany does and Vermont does not, I like to think, but Albany really does have a culture of corruption. And that comes when those in power feel like they're in it to just get theirs. It makes it hard for somebody who's coming up and maybe got in it for dreams, where the gentleman over here was asking about when people get in it. Maybe got in it because they dreamed about doing something about their local school. But when they see their leaders getting rich and sort of sitting there for years and not really doing anything, I think it's really hard to get motivated to then pull out your best self. And that then infects the whole culture and then also makes it harder to recruit people to run for office. Because they then think, I don't want to be part of that social community. So, yeah, Silver might be up there.
And we have time for one more.
Hi, Professor TEACHOUT. Sorry, I just got really nervous. My name is Anna Chimino, and I am also a 1L. And I came to law school because I wanted to continue to advocate for my community at large, and I find that the law and politics are powerful tools to create systemic change. And I think it's really easy, especially for me, to become a little bit cynical about politics especially. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate leaders such as yourself coming and speaking to us and opening that dialogue. And I think this ties in with your question, Amanda, that one of the ways to become part of or make that change is to be active and global and community-oriented citizens. So thank you. That's it.
What's your name? Anna said it better than I could, so I want to end on that. And thank you all so much for being an incredible audience. Thank you to the dean and to the whole community for coming out and asking great questions.